Good afternoon. I'm Melissa Durkee. I'm from the United States. I'm at the University of Georgia School of Law now. I'm one of the lawyers in this confluence of lawyers and political scientists. But soon I'm moving to Washington University School of Law, so if you want to find me in the future, you can find me there. I'm delighted to be here today and to have these discussions, some of which I understand. My French isn't quite up to the task, but I'm learning more by the moment. In any case, the title of the project that I'd like to present today is The Ambivalent Logics of Business Representation in International Organizations. So here's the agenda of the project. I'm trying to organize perspectives on the inclusion and exclusion of non-state actors in the activities of international organizations. And among all the possible non-state actors, I'm particularly interested in corporations and the trade and industry associations that represent them. So this makes a perfect segue from the discussion that we just heard. So private commercial actors, market actors, and I'll explain a bit more about what motivates that focus in just a moment. My working thesis is that international access structures and the rationales offered to justify them are modeled on one of two logics: the logic of publicness and the logic of expedience. Now, for those of you who read the paper, I used a different term there. I said the logic of representation, and I'm still playing back and forth between these two terms. So I'd be curious to hear feedback on that choice of terms, but there's good reasons for either of them. So the point is, by whatever terminology, the point is that there's two organizing logics that we can see in the way that the IOs are organizing themselves, composing themselves with respect to non-state actors, and particularly business actors. And the argument is that these logics have framed choices, structured choices, to open and close international organizations and their lawmaking processes to market actors over the past century or so. And these logics can operate like sliding doors, right? Sliding past each other without being in conversation. They prioritize different values, they have different agendas, different blind spots, and of course, different potential consequences. So in this talk, I would like to first give a little intellectual autobiography to explain the origins of this project and how this builds on prior work that I think might intersect with the themes of this project, this conference, and then frame the two logics as ideal types, and then third, set them out briefly in historic context. So to start with some background and framing, I've been working for the past decade or so on how businesses are involved in various aspects of international lawmaking and the rules of access that either facilitate or restrain this involvement. And in connection with this work, I became acquainted with a strand of literature that many of you have referenced or alluded to this morning or in the papers. And this literature was really dominant, as many of us have recognized, in the 1990s, but it's still very alive and well today. It sees NGOs as legitimate participants in the work of international organizations, indeed as potential democratizing influences. So here we have former UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who says, NGOs are a basic form of popular representation in the present-day world and a guarantee of political legitimacy of international organizations. It's just really strong words. Fast forward to 2004, and the panel of eminent persons on UN civil society relations said in the Cardozo report, the growing participation and influence of non-state actors is enhancing democracy and reshaping multilateralism. So I've called this before strong legitimacy optimism. This is the idea that NGOs can offer a form of popular representation, direct representation in the work of international organizations. It's a cosmopolitan idea that moves beyond representation by nation states. The idea is that NGOs can contribute to the legitimacy of international legal rules in a democratizing fashion akin to voting by global representatives. And of course, there's been a lot of critique of this position, but it still has its strong proponents. Here is Former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, I see a United Nations which recognizes that the non-governmental organizations revolution, the new global people power, or whatever else you wish to call this explosion of citizens' concern at the global level, is the best thing that has happened to our organization in a long time. Strong legitimacy optimism. But who, I would like to ask, is part of this global people power, this explosion of citizens' concern at the international level? Well, it turns out that many NGOs accredited through the consultancy system at ECOSOC and working throughout the UN system in its various institutions are trade and industry associations. So the global people power also includes private commercial associations. 10% or so of the NGOs accredited at ECOSOC are private commercial associations, and other organizations like the International Maritime Association, the percentage is much, much higher, perhaps 50%. But this literature that's celebrating the legitimizing function of NGOs seemed to me to have a real blind spot here. It's when it's celebrating NGO capacity to serve a representative function for some under-conceptualized global public, the literature does not seem to recognize that business groups are part of this public. They also contribute to lawmaking processes under the guise of NGOs. Indeed, since Andrew Arado and Gene Cohen's work in the early 90s, where they were conceptualizing business, civil society, and government as separate legs or three legs of a three-leg stool, many literatures have continued to distinguish business from civil society. So in a recent article, Ken Abbott and David Gartner talked about the trust people have in NGOs, and contrasted this with lower amounts of trust and confidence in business and government. And the authors used this finding to advocate for an enhanced NGO presence in global governance to increase trust in international legal rules. So of course, this assumes that NGOs and businesses are separate and that they're playing distinct roles in the international system. So I've been interrogating this assumption as a matter of both positive law and normative theory. And one of the observations I've been trying to make is that the institutional design choices that are focused on NGOs as representatives of global publics will not necessarily be suited to commercial NGOs. Yet, those commercial NGOs are going to be availing themselves of these same participation pathways. And this is happening throughout the UN system. So, if you'll pardon the metaphor, when we're thinking about democratic representation in international organizations, business groups are the elephant in the room. How we conceive of business participation in international governance should affect the institutional design choices that international organizations make. And there are at least 4 ways that we can conceive of this, and these overlap. Are these market actors democratizing influence, as the strong legitimacy optimists would think? Are they part of the people power? Do they confer legitimacy on organizations by their very presence? Or are they interests, and this is concordant with what Professor Lewis was saying, are they interests that should be represented on the same terms as interests represented by other NGOs and civil society? Third, are they helpful partners with special kinds of expertise and capacity? Or 4, are they nefarious forces that should be carefully addressed, perhaps through lobbying regulations? In fact, in the United States, trade and industry associations are considered particularly nefarious influences that need to be carefully regulated. So 4 different possibilities: democratizing influences, interests, helpful partners, or damaging influences. So as I've observed in the chapter prepared for today and elsewhere in my work, international organizations, for the most part, haven't resolved this question. They haven't designed approaches to non-state actor participation, and particularly commercial groups, that explicitly frame them in one of these ways and regulate them accordingly. In this project, I'm thinking about perspectives on inclusion of for-profit actors in the work of international organizations. What are the rationalities that animate movements to include or exclude these actors? What are some of the ideas that are lurking behind the choices international organizations make to open or close their doors to business actors? So really, in this piece, instead of creating an argument from first principles or looking descriptively at the effect of business participation on various lawmaking processes. I'm instead looking at narratives that have attached to their participation and organizing these into two basic logics. So this is a really significant question because business groups are involved in a wide variety of ways in the UN system. So as I've mentioned in this talk already, they serve as consultants or observers alongside other kinds of NGOs at ECOSOC and various UN entities, but this is just one of a really broad landscape of kinds of participation now. They also serve on state delegations and various lawmaking processes. And usually states don't have to announce who's on their delegation, so this can be quite extensive and not very transparent. They serve as participants in multi-stakeholder entities, whether our classic example, the International Labor Organization, or new instantiations, new multi-stakeholder partnerships. They fund and sponsor projects which can shape lawmaking processes, which can shape which lawmaking processes even get started or get initiated. They also undertake a vast and heterogeneous array of formal and informal partnerships of various kinds. And I have some examples in the paper that just show how broad this category is, because the examples I'm giving are quite unlike each other. So this is really a quite significant phenomenon. The movement to open up UN entities to collaborations with business entities has been described as transformative for the UN. It's extensive, it's trans-substantive, it cuts across institutions. Yet despite this, this change is really under-theorized. It's been described as a silent revolution, right, that has not received nearly the attention that, for instance, the NGO revolution did in the 1990s. Not only have we not developed adequate frameworks to regulate these relationships, we haven't even developed adequate frameworks to conceptualize these relationships in the literature and to imagine what we'd like them to be. So that background should frame the idea I'm trying to explore in this chapter, and that is that there are these two basic logics that are animating the ways that international organizations organize themselves with respect to private commercial actors: a logic of publicness or representation and a logic of expedience. Now, of course, anytime you perform a grand lumping exercise like this, creating broad categories, you're going to minimize important differences. So whether it's important to minimize or overlook all the differences that exist in these two perspectives depends on whether these categories produce anything useful. And I think that here they do. I think they help clarify and make sense of IO organizational choices with respect to private sector actors and clarify the choices ahead. So in the paper, I begin with an anecdote that brought these questions to a head for me, and that was these two narratives in popular and social media reporting from the Glasgow Climate Conference, which was in late 2021. And the first narrative, down here in this corner, centers public process values like representation and input legitimacy. And those critiquing the failures of the Glasgow Conference seem to be concerned not just about substantive failures and the state pledges that were made there, but also about public law values like representation, transparency, and equality in the process of decision making. And they were linking these failures in substance to failures in process. They expressed concern that that states were not taking more ambitious climate action within the COP process because there were too many representatives, for example, of the fossil fuel industry in the conference. So this little chart here from the BBC, this newspaper headline ricocheted across the media with dozens of articles picking up this same headline about the number of fossil fuel industry representatives that were represented at the conference. And of course, there was a lot of protesting about this as well. So the idea here was that bad, tainted outcomes flow from a tainted, illegitimate process. But there's a second narrative that emerged from this conference as well that shifted focus from the representativeness of the process to the functional outcomes of the process, and highlighted progress from any source, not just the pledges that were made by state parties. So this narrative is focused on consequences, successes, on the 1.5 degree Celsius goal. It celebrated in particular the GFANZ project, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And then the headline here was that the climate transition had been set in place, right? This language of achievement of a goal. Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, said something very telling. He said, after celebrating the fact that private actors had pledged $130 billion to the climate transition, he said, this pledging has made a 1.5 degree Celsius world possible. Past tense. It's made it possible. He also put governments in a distinctly secondary place, saying, now we need governments to help get the job done by setting ambitious policies that can unlock, accelerate, and help direct the investment to where it's needed most. So here, the private pledgees, the banks and financiers who were pledging $130 billion had made this transition possible. The government role was to help implement. Two really different narratives here. Here, the actors in the process are valued for their functional contributions. And I was also struck by the fact that these celebratory stories and the critical stories, again, function like sliding doors. They seem to be in separate universes. Articles printed by the same papers were spoken with one or the other, but not both of these voices. The GFANZ crew is dismissing the youth activist crew. The stories of fossil fuel representatives in the room were full of suspicion and didn't mention the GFANZ pledges. So the perspectives don't seem to be at all in conversation. So here is the logic of expedience. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. The United Nations and business need each other. We need your innovation, your initiative, your technological prowess. But business also needs the United Nations. In a very real sense, the work of the United Nations can be viewed as seeking to create the ideal enabling environment within which business can thrive. So this is focused not on interest representation, but on synergistic problem solving, on functional outcomes, on expertise and capacity. Here's the logic of publicness. Here are 1990s era reforms to the ECOSOC access regulations that tried to ensure that NGOs were authentic representatives of their various interests and constituencies. So they're focusing on whether NGOs have a democratically adopted constitution, whether the NGO speaks for its members through authorized representatives, whether it has a representative structure and possesses appropriate mechanisms of accountability to its members. These criteria are focused on interest representation rather than on function or capacity. The concern is what interests are being represented through these NGOs, not on what capacities the NGOs bring to the table. So there's a bit of a lot going on in this slide, but this table is also in the paper, and it's gathering characteristics of these two logics. So the logic of publicness values democratic self-determination, representation of interests, transparency of public officials, accountability. The logic of expedience values efficiency, problem solving, incremental progress, mission-driven activity, with the emphasis on activity. The logic of publicness sees the problems facing the international system as distortions of public authority in the democratic process. We have problems like rent-seeking, imperfect interest representation, replication of entrenched power structures, over-representation of the global elites. The logic of expedience sees the problems facing the international system as information problems and capacity problems, requiring innovation, synergistic thinking, market-based solutions, less bureaucracy. The logic of publicness draws its legitimacy from democratic values like representation, accountability of public officials for acts taken in the public interest. It views legitimacy through the lenses of democracy and representation. This is an approach that's emphasizing the publicness of acts that have consequences for the lives of individuals and population. That is, those purporting to take action in the public interest have to bear public authority to do this. That authority is often grounded in a principle of representation. And these officials have to be, in turn, constrained in their exercise of authority by notions of accountability to the public. And so, as we've heard this morning, and we'll hear again throughout this conference, different theories within this logic will focus on different units of authority. Those could be national governments, those could be smaller, self-determining political communities, those could be non-state representatives, etc. But in this approach, Bottom really wants to make sure that the right actors are contributing, however that rightness is conceived. Whereas the logic of expedience doesn't have this focus on publicness, rather it might emphasize free and open markets as a solution to public problems. This is a neoliberal strain. It might emphasize the importance of knowledge. This is a technocratic strain. It might emphasize that allowing competition between approaches produces the best strategies, a form of pluralism. But in all of these cases, the legitimacy here is drawn through action. It's drawn through accomplishing progress on goals. This approach wants to make sure that a process efficiently incorporates expertise. The appropriate actors are not determined through status, but through competencies, through what they bring to the table. So the blind spots for the logic of publicness are really output legitimacy. This is an approach that's concerned with input legitimacy, less with output legitimacy, so effectiveness failures. The logic of expedience, the blind spot for this approach are legitimacy problems, deliberative failures, the entrenchment of Western economic elites. They're concerned with output legitimacy, and so input legitimacy is a blind spot. And then I've framed one as deontological and the other as consequentialist. So as I've said before, proponents of one logic or the other will have differences of opinion about some of the details, right? Theories falling within the representation logic may be concerned about the authority of nation states in the international system, deriving public authority at the international level from representative structures within the nation state. Or a more cosmopolitan approach might seek representation of populations or interests, whether or not mediated by governments. Theories falling within the expedience logic might be more technocratic, taking a knowledge-based perspective, or they might be more neoliberal, seeing synergies between the goals of the public and private sectors and advocating for market-based solutions to public problems, for example. And of course, as I've alluded to in the discussion so far, these two positions lead to distinct perspectives about the participation of private sector or market actors in international governance. One, of course, the expedience, logic of expedience sees these as a source of expertise, and the logic of publicness can either see them as a force that taints the process, or perhaps a community whose interests should be represented but not overrepresented. All right, so we can look back over the past century or so of relationships between international organizations and private actors and see a push and pull between these logics. Whether this be the logic of action in the League of Nations approach of business groups as perfectly aligned with public goals, or the logic of publicness in the UN's focus on nations as units of representative authority at its very founding, which brought an attempt to elevate international organizations, as public institutions by clarifying that all non-governmental groups would have a secondary status, a subsidiary status that remained throughout the Cold War. Or the logic of publicness in the new reform efforts at ECOSOC in the 90s that focused on interest groups as units of representational authority. These are focused on public authority and tried to assure that NGOs participating in the work of the UN were adequately representative of their respective communities. We then see the logic of action come blazing back in the early 21st century with Kofi Annan's Global Compact and the warm embrace of business entities in so many aspects of the UN's work. But then now I think we're in an ambivalent era, right? We're seeing the logic of publicness in the flurry of suspicion in the popular press over corporate representatives at Glasgow, but we're also seeing the strong emphasis on efficiency throughout the UN system in this warm embrace of business as a partner in its work. And we see the push and pull between these logics in disputes at the World Health Organization, at UNCITRAL, and show that they're both, that there is ambivalence between these. So I'm happy to talk more about this history in the discussion if you're interested. But let me skip to the bottom line here. The bottom line is we should be thinking about how international organizations are composing themselves with respect to the private sector actors, especially in light of the extensiveness of the ways that private sector actors are now embedded in the UN's work. I don't think we can really have a discussion about democratic representation in international organizations without recognizing these roles. So how do we think about democratic representation in light of this participation? And this project, I think, really at bottom makes 2 points. First, this is an important question to include. So, as I just said, and really I'm not leaning hard on one particular answer to this. Business roles may enhance representation if we're thinking of interest representation, or they might corrupt it, depending on how this is constrained and regulated. But the second point is that resolving this question really requires greater clarity about what we expect of international organizations. Do we require organizations that facilitate representation and self-determination, either mediated through the state or in some other more direct way? Do we want that? Or do we want organizations that accomplish agendas? Right, so do we want organizations that facilitate representation, or do we want organizations that accomplish agendas, like addressing the climate crisis and improving sanitation in the developing world? Which is most important? Is representation a guardrail around an ends-oriented process, or is it a constitutive force that has to be protected at all costs? So the premise of this conference suggests an embrace of the logic of publicness. And I would say that embracing that logic will really require confronting, answering the logic of expedience, which is both increasingly prominent and has really deep historic roots. Thank you very much.